Well, let me add my thanks to all those that have been extended already to the marvelous staff of the Hauenstein Center. And let me add a word of thanks of my own, and that is to all of you in this room who probably had any number of interesting and appealing ways to spend your Friday, but chose to spend them this way. My title, or my topic, I should say, is Vice President Cheney, Dick Cheney. Now, the word meteoric, you know, the bright glowing object sort of streaking through the sky, the word meteoric is not the first word that comes to mind for most people when they think of Richard B. Cheney. In books that have been written about the Bush administration, you see nouns associated with him like gravity, seriousness, prudence. You see adjectives associated with Cheney in these books like opaque, subdued, taciturn, unflappable, meteoric with its connotations of energy and action and dazzle, probably not. Yet consider, in 1968, at the age of 27, Richard B. Cheney was a struggling graduate student in political science at the University of Wisconsin. 7 years later, he was the White House Chief of Staff in the Ford administration, the youngest by far, before or since, to occupy that role. When Ford lost his bid for election in 1976, Cheney went home and 2 years later ran for the U.S. House of Representatives from Wyoming, was elected, freshman member of the House. Within 10 years, he was the second-ranking Republican in the U.S. House of Representatives. Meteoric, beginning to sound like about the right word. Having ascended to the top in the White House and in Congress, Cheney became head of a major cabinet department when President George Bush appointed him Secretary of Defense in 1989. He held that position during the Gulf War, the war that drove Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army out of Kuwait in 1991. When Bush was defeated for re-election in 1992, Cheney hung his hat for a while at the American Enterprise Institute as a senior fellow while preparing to seek the 1996 Republican presidential nomination. After campaigning widely for his party's candidates in the 1994 midterm, Cheney decided, quote, "I really don't want to go do it," meaning run for president. He abandoned his candidacy, soon became president of the Halliburton Company. 5 years later, at the age of 59, Cheney was elected Vice President of the United States. And so, meteoric, not the word that instantly comes to mind in connection with Dick Cheney, but perhaps the word that should. Within the span of a quarter century, Cheney occupied a host of important leadership positions as he advanced from youth to middle age, serving prominently in all but the judicial branch of government, as well as in the corporate world. The same less than obvious word may be applied to the vice presidency. For many years, the office was the butt of jokes and gibes. Cheney himself, in 1996, called being vice president, quote, "a cruddy job." And yet, at the same time that Cheney was engaged in his own meteoric rise, the vice presidency was experiencing its own steep ascent. He inherited, when he became vice president, a strong office. The birth of the modern vice presidency is usually traced to 1976, when Democratic nominee for president Jimmy Carter selected Walter Mondale as his running mate, and then in 1977, when Carter and Mondale worked out an arrangement for their relationship that gave the vice president a dramatically enhanced role in the administration. Carter established the modern pattern of vice presidential selection. When well in advance of his party's national convention, he began a careful search for a running mate. In choosing Mondale, Carter gave the nod to someone who was more experienced in public life than he was. And that's a pattern that has held forth not consistently, but frequently ever since. Ronald Reagan when he chose George Bush as his running mate, Michael Dukakis when he chose Lloyd Bentsen, Bill Clinton when he chose Al Gore, and of course George W. Bush when he chose Cheney, a presidential candidate choosing a vice presidential candidate with a more impressive resume, if you will, of having held prominent government offices. I don't think there's ever been a vice president, though, who, in effect, chose himself. Bush asked Cheney, who he got to know when Cheney was moved to Texas as part of his association with the Halliburton Company. Cheney, who didn't know George W. Bush very well, thought it was a good thing to do for a major corporate president to get to know the governor of the state. Went over and introduced himself. Obviously, they had a lot of common connections from the past. In late 1998, when Bush was thinking of running for president in 2000, Cheney became part of a group of foreign policy experts who advised and to a large extent educated Bush about global affairs as he prepared to make that candidacy. And Bush later recalled this about Cheney during that process of getting to know him at foreign policy briefings while he was mulling his candidacy for president. Bush said, "He didn't speak a lot, but the one guy that pretty much commanded, I felt, the respect of everyone around the table during these meetings was Cheney. And so he got my attention." Cheney told Bush several times that he was not interested in being vice president. Did he mean it, or was he coyly playing hard to get? The question arises because Cheney also persuaded Bush that the ideal running mate would have a record of prominent service in the White House, Congress, the private sector, and as head of an executive department. None of the other possibilities came close to meeting these criteria. In an even more important way, even more important departure from modern vice presidential selection, Bush chose someone who had no remaining presidential ambitions. Cheney had tested the waters. Once, in 1996, he found that he was, quote, uncomfortable with the pressure to reveal his feelings and talk about his family. Does that sound like the Dick Cheney you know? Between 1978 and 1988, he had 3 heart attacks. He had another one just weeks after the 2000 election. By temperament, Cheney was someone who was most comfortable outside the spotlight. When he was in the Ford administration, his Secret Service code name was almost comically apt, backseat. Of all the heroes to emerge from the first Gulf War, Cheney was the only one not to write a self-serving memoir. Bush found Cheney's reticence, his lack of further ambition for the presidency, enormously appealing. Bush said at one time, when you're getting advice from somebody, if you think deep down that part of that advice is to advance a personal agenda, you discount that advice. For all Cheney's seniority, he always showed deference to Bush. Yes, Mr. President. No, Mr. President. When Bush wasn't around, he referred to him as the man, as in the man wants this. Bush frequently declared that in picking a running mate, he was choosing a vice president, not just a candidate for vice president to help him win the election. Mark my words, Bush said in June of 2000, there will be a crisis in my administration, and Dick Cheney is exactly the man you want at your side in a crisis. In truth, Bush's emphasis on Cheney's governing credentials doubled as a shrewd electoral strategy. Good government and good politics were going hand in hand here. Voters wanted to be reassured that as a governor, Bush would have at his side an experienced Washington hand with a deep foreign policy resume. Cheney's presence on the ticket provided this reassurance to the voters. Well, famously, the 2000 election did not end on Election Day. Cheney was given, during the period of uncertainty, a governing rather than a political assignment to run the transition process, vetting prospective cabinet and staff appointees on the assumption that the election would be resolved favorably. Although no previous vice president had ever run a transition, the decision to have Cheney run Bush's made sense. Cheney had participated in 2 previous presidential transitions, and he had served as a cabinet and staff member at a high level.